This is a straight from camera raw file that I captured this morning at about 5:25 a.m. in a rice field near my house. I'm going to take you through the post-processing that shows how I got from the original image to this finished image in about 10 minutes using Lightroom and Photoshop. That's Lightroom 4 and Photoshop CS6. So here we are in Lightroom with my original image. The first thing I do is make a virtual copy so I can do my edits there. Now I apply a medium contrast curve to give me a good starting point. Next, I'll pull down the tint just a little bit towards green to bring out the greens in the rice grass. Now in doing this I lose a little bit of the warm glow from the sun, but I'll fix that later. Next I'm going to increase clarity to add some nice mid-tone contrast. And I'll pull up the vibrance and saturation as well. For me, this image is all about color, so I'm going to pull up the saturation a few points. Now I'm creating a gradient to add some pink back into the top right portion of the image and bring back a little of that reddish glow from the sunrise. Now I'll do the opposite. I'll add a gradient bringing the tint towards green in the bottom portion of the image to emphasize the greens in the rice grass at the bottom of the frame. Here's my before and after. That's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to pull up my midtones and pull down the shadows just a little bit to increase the contrast. I like to increase contrast with a tone curve rather than just the contrast controls, but I'll pull up the overall general contrast as well just a little bit. Next step is to add a split tone. This is something I commonly do. It's a yellow-blue split tone, so yellow in the highlights and blue in the shadows. This adds a little bit of depth to the image by cooling the shadows and warming the highlights. And I'm going to pull up those blues just a little bit more. I cool the overall white balance just a few points. That looks pretty good. As I edit, I often check my before and after to see how I'm doing and make sure I haven't gone too far. Now I'll sharpen just a little bit, and also a few points of noise reduction. Next is to add a vignette. I have a preset for this, but my vignette preset I think is a little bit too much for this photo, so I'm going to dial that back just a little bit. And that's looking pretty good. I think this is as far as I'll go in Lightroom, and here we'll move to Photoshop to really put the finishing touches on the image. In Photoshop, the first thing I'm going to do is change my color mode to lab color. This gives me some very nice color controls. And I'm going to apply a curves adjustment. What I'm looking to do now is really bring out the reddish orange glow that I imagine and that I remember from the sunrise. I'm going to go too far with this. It's going to look kind of weird, but I will mask this in later. We'll change this layer to red. I'll add another one. This time I'm going to target the greens with another curves adjustment. Again, I'm going to go too far with this because I plan to mask this adjustment in. And you'll see how to do that in a few minutes. And I'll change this layer name to green. With a final curves adjustment, I'm going to look to bring out a little bit of blue in the shadows, sort of a trademark adjustment of mine. That's at the bottom portion of this curve. Again, I'm going to go too far with this because I can play with my layer opacity later. And I'm also going to mask this in. I'll name this layer Blue Shadows. Now I'm going to turn off my top two layers and focus only on my red layer right here. By selecting my mask and hitting Command I, I can invert the mask, so I have a mask that's filled with black. Now I'm going to use a gradient tool to draw this adjustment back in. I've actually gone the wrong way here, so I'm going to undo that and try again. Now you can see this is drawing in the adjustment. Look at my layer mask there. You can see that only the top right portion is white, but still I don't like that, so I'm going to try one more time. So in the layers palette again, you can see the gradient showing up on my layer mask, and that looks pretty good. So now I'm going to work with the green layer. I'm going to do the opposite here. I want to mask this adjustment in only on the bottom left portion of the frame. So I've inverted my mask. I have a mask that's filled with black. And I'm going to draw this gradient line. And that looks a little bit weird, so let's try again at a slightly steeper angle. And that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to go to my blue shadows layer and do the same thing. I select my mask, I hit Command-I to invert that mask. That would be Control-I on Windows. And I'm going to draw this gradient pretty much straight down, because I only want this blue effect in the shadows at the bottom of the frame. Now I'll use my opacity slider to dial that back just a little bit, until it's barely noticeable. Subtle adjustments are really the key, so I'll dial back this green adjustment as well. And finally I'm going to dial back this red. I like this strong orange that I've created here, so I'm going to keep that one pretty high. Now I select all three layers and hit Command-G to group them. That would be Control-G if you're working on Windows. And now I can vary the opacity of this adjustment all at once. Here's my before, and here's my after. So I've really brought out the colors here. I like that, so I'm going to merge the layers and go back to RGB color. Now I'm going to do an adjustment that brings out some nice glow. So I've created a new layer, and I'm going to add a blur to that new layer. You want to keep a little bit of detail, but really make sure the blur shows. Now I change my blending mode to soft light. This is going to create a really high contrast look. It's a little bit over the top, but I'm going to dial that back. First I use a hue saturation adjustment, and I'm going to pull up the saturation a little bit, because for me this image is really all about color. Now with the curves adjustment, I'm going to pull up the black point just a little bit, because I think that soft light layer has really brought the blacks down too much. Now again, I'm going to group these three layers and vary that adjustment all at once. I'll call this group glow. And I'll add another curves adjustment here, just pulling down the black point and adding a very subtle S-curve to bring out the contrast. Toggle that off and on. That looks pretty good. And here's that glow adjustment. Now I'm going to dial back the opacity of this adjustment so it's not too much. I'll do the same thing with this curves adjustment. There's my before and after with these adjustments, and that looks pretty good. So again, I merge all layers. The last thing I'm going to do is add an auto contrast adjustment. This is just a final finishing touch, and I'll fade that back to about 70%. Now I save my image and I'll jump back to Lightroom. So here we are back in Lightroom, and you can see the three images there. Here's the original straight from camera raw file. Here's my Lightroom edit. And here's the finished image after Photoshop. So here we are again with the original raw file straight from camera with no editing whatsoever, and the finished image after Lightroom and Photoshop. I used in Photoshop lab color and curves adjustment with layer mask to bring out the colors, and then a blurred layer with soft light blending mode to increase the contrast and add a soft glow. This is my first attempt at a behind the scenes post-processing video. It's a little bit more difficult than I thought, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. Reach out to me on Flickr, Google+, or in the comments down below. Thanks for watching.